reminding you what you've already heard, that the talks are sponsored by the American Scientific Affiliation, which is a network of Christian scientists who are Christians, and that we got a grant to support these talks, but that's sort of running out, and so one way we can get additional support for it is if people would like to join the American Scientific Affiliation and mention that that is through the efforts of this chapter, then we get additional support for talks through that. Also mentioned the National Radio Astronomy Observatory, which has supported the AV equipment and so on for the talks, and the local churches that support it, and that obviously includes St. Paul's here with the building. There are representatives on the organizing committee from the Baptist, Episcopal, and Methodist churches, and we're always very happy to have additional participation by other churches. So if you're here from another church and you enjoy what you're hearing, you might approach your church about helping to sponsor this and provide some kind of support for it. I'm not sure whether the library was mentioned, but we have a library of books that have been purchased by the ASA that are on topics that are related to science and religion, and you are welcome to check those out for free and just bring them back prior to the next talk. And again, if you're interested in hearing about it, if you sign up, we'll send you an email message on it. We do have a website, and we're going to send out the email address for that website in the next message. And we are very selective in whom we auction off our listeners. The next talk is going to be on November 20th, so it's going to be on our usual Thursday date instead of on a Tuesday. And I'm sorry, I got the wrong month. October 20th, that's right. And that is by Dr. Steve Collins from Trinity Theological Seminary. that would be a bit of Freudian. Seminary. And he is an archaeologist, and he will be talking on a highly salacious topic, so I'm sure that you will want to be there. Sodom, Discovery of a Lost City. And that will be followed in November 20th by Ken Turon talking about creation care, does it matter? With that, I'll introduce today's speaker, who is Brother Guy Consolmagno.
I'll let you can't say it with your hands full. It's an Italian name. Consolmagno.
Consolmagno.
Brother Guy. Just go Brother Guy.
Astronomer at the Vatican Observatory and is also the president of the Vatican Observatory Foundation. And he received undergraduate and master's degrees from MIT and a PhD in planetary science from the University of Arizona. And he has been a member of the Jesuit Order since 1989. He has over 200 publications on planetary science and is also the author of 7 popular books, of which I will emphasize the one that you see on the table here, which has the same title as our talk today.
By an amazing coincidence.
So if you like the talk, you should definitely buy one of his books. And if you don't like the talk, you should give the book a bad review. Brother Guy.
Thank you. This actually isn't the first book that I've written about intelligent life and the church's response to it. I was asked about 10 years ago to write, I mean, this looks beautiful, this is the cover. It's one of these pamphlets, it's actually about that big, that you get in the back of churches. And it was for the Catholic Truth Society, which is an outfit in England. And I've got a lot of English connections for reasons I don't know. They said, you know, what does the church teach about extraterrestrials? And I said, the church doesn't teach anything. Great, people always ask us, can you write a booklet about that? Nothing, nothing, nothing. We need 10,000 words. So I had, you know, besides repeating the word, we don't know 10,000 times. I'm a planetary scientist. I do a lot of popular talks about planetary science. And I was in England in September of 2010 as one of the speakers at something called the Birmingham Science, I've got it written down here, the Birmingham Science Festival. And so that's me dressed up with my Maxwell's Equation t-shirt, about to give a talk. Well, they said, we'd like to publicize the talk. Would you agree to talk to a couple of journalists? So I said, sure, why not? What I didn't realize was that the day that I was speaking in Birmingham was exactly the same day that Pope Benedict was speaking in Birmingham. So all they wanted to ask me about was the Pope. And they would ask questions like, you know, where do you disagree the most with the Pope? And how has the Pope tried to undermine your science? Like, number one, even if those questions were true, you think I'm going to tell a reporter that? But more to the point, you know, the premise was wrong. This was Pope Benedict. He was not only such a scientist that he speaks German, but he brings his own white lab coat. Finally, because they weren't getting the kinds of juicy topics that they wanted to get from me, one of them asks me out of the blue, so, would you baptize an extraterrestrial? To which I replied, only if they ask. And everybody got a laugh. And then the next day, that's how they reported it. They do, in the small print, have the only if they ask answer. But they reported this as if this was a major breakthrough. The Vatican has decided they're going to baptize extraterrestrials. Well, the question is, really, why that reaction? Incidentally, that was the original cover. This is the cover we finally came up with. I think the new one is more elegant, but the old one is kind of funny. The original subtitle I wanted to have was, and all the other stupid questions that people ask us. But in fact, it's not a stupid question. Why is it a question that we keep getting asked over and over again? I mean, obviously, we think it's the kind of question that's going to sell books. That's why we use it for the title of the book. But why? What is the hidden agenda behind a question like, would you baptize an extraterrestrial? I think one of the agendas that was there with the British journalists, who are notorious for being the most skeptical and cynical people on the face of the earth, is that, here what the question was coming from, along with, how has the Pope tried to suppress your work, and would you baptize an extraterrestrial? They were aggressive questions. They were trying to find a way to make me look stupid, or at least make my church look stupid. They thought it was a gotcha question. Because you see, think of it. If I had said, yes, I will baptize an extraterrestrial, I would be saying that stupid little me on this tiny little planet, on this tiny little star, thinks he knows enough to be able to convince people who are so advanced that they could cross the realms of space to come to us and tell them about God. How arrogant that would be. But if I had said, no, I wouldn't baptize an extraterrestrial, then I would be implicitly saying that Christianity is only for the yokels on this tiny little planet. It has no cosmic significance. Either way, they got me, right? So they were all set to get me. But instead, what I answered was, only if they ask. Which is to say, what if someone who is from such an advanced civilization, from such a universe-traveling culture, came and asked for learning about Christ from us? That would mean that they were endorsing what had happened to us. By making it the choice of the person being baptized. Of course, that's good theology. But it's also a recognition that maybe we do have something to teach the world, and likewise maybe the rest of the universe has something to teach us. one of the points I want to emphasize is, of course, we have not seen extraterrestrials. One of the other reasons I keep getting this question is because there are a lot of true believers out there. I don't know the general public, I've not done any kind of survey, but what I have found anecdotally among college students, the more likely the college student is to believe in UFOs, the less likely they are to go to church. UFOs become a religion substitute. Nonetheless, we do speculate about extraterrestrials, and we've always speculated about extraterrestrials. Human beings have always found the topic of these creatures fascinating. Going back to stories about other races and other creatures, you find it among the ancient Greeks. They knew that there were not human beings, half-horse creatures, but they loved telling stories about them. What's going on here? The ancient Greek and Roman myths are populated by gods, by heroes, by demons, by all of these strange creatures. And then, in the year, this is an edition of 1909, but in fact, in the year AD 160, Lucian of Samosata writes what may be the first written account of travel of human beings to other planets. They knew what planets were as dots of light in the sky. He was able to have the imagination to say, maybe we could go there. Maybe there are going to be places that you can walk around on, where there will be races like us. And basically, he then describes a whole series of wars that they have on the surface of Mars, and the surface of Jupiter, and the surface of the Sun, and other unlikely places. Even the Bible talks about non-human intelligences. The angels. The whole question, I don't know how many of you remember Pogo. He was kind of the Doonesbury of the 60s, or I don't know what the correct great cartoon is. It's a little fuzzy. So the porcupine, who is the philosopher, is saying, I've been reading about how maybe there's planets peopled by folks with advanced brains. On the other hand, maybe we've got the most brains. Maybe our intellects are the universe's most advanced. Either way, it's a sobering thought. It is a sobering thought. It's a sobering thought because astronomy pulls us out of our comfortable day-to-day world, makes us recognize that there's more to the universe than what's for lunch. And so, there's a little bit of a question, a little bit of a doubt, a little bit of a fear that maybe the things that we think are important really aren't important in the cosmic scheme of things. Maybe even God, or at least our vision of God, is ridiculous when compared to how small we are, how big the universe is. On the other hand, you could also say, I've heard this both ways. The universe is so big, we're so tiny, how could there be a God who actually even pays attention to me, much less listens to my prayers? That's absurd, that's stupid, I refuse to believe. Or you could say, the universe is so big, I'm so small, I'm so insignificant. The fact that God nonetheless does pay attention to me and care about me and answer my prayers tells me just how incredibly big that God must be. Because you see, as you have probably recognized, God is not something we come to at the end of a logical set of premises. God is the assumption we make before we create a logic. Because all logical systems have to start with an assumption. If I assume there is no God, I can prove logically that there is no God, because I'm basically recovering my assumption. Likewise, if I assume there is a God, I can see plenty of evidence of God in the universe once I've assumed it. That's not a proof. That's merely a self-consistency. If you assumed it and then found out it didn't work, you'd be a little worried. But the fact that it does work isn't a proof, because God is not something to prove. For that matter, science doesn't do proofs, but it's a whole different... I've got two books up here. One of these is a dogmatic treatise, God, the author of nature and the supernatural, by a German theologian who came to America, the Reverend Joseph Poole, PhD, DD, former professor of fundamental theology in the Catholic University of America, now professor of dogma at the University of Breslau. He argues that it is essential for there to be extraterrestrials because it is the natural outcome of God's creative power. He's not the only one who came to that conclusion. John Herschel, who was the son of William Herschel, the fellow who discovered Uranus, the founder of the, John Herschel was one of the founders of the Royal Astronomical Society. He also was insistent that belief in God and belief in God as a creator led you immediately to the recognition that the universe would be filled with intelligence. I think the argument is very similar to the one that Carl Sagan once said, if there are no people out there, sure is a waste of space. On the other hand, you've got Thomas Paine, the famous radical, famous cynic of the 18th century. In The Age of Reason, he argues that either Christianity insists on the unlikely proposition that of all the worlds in the universe, God decided to come to this one because some guy and some girl ate an apple, which he thinks is very unlikely. Or, to quote him, the person who is irreverently called Son of God would have nothing else to do than to travel from world to world in an endless succession of death with scarcely a moment for life in between. Obviously that's absurd to him as well. It's a kind of a crude argument. I will merely point out that, at least in Catholic theology, we argue that every sacrifice of the Mass is Christ 1,000,000 times a day, coming, being sacrificed, and being, then carried into our bodies. That's what our theology of the Eucharist is. We don't find it absurd at all. I mean, that's why they call him God, right? But more than that, who's to say that every race's or every entity's salvation story has to be exactly the same, follow the same pattern? We already have in our own Christian tradition the story of angels and the story of the fall of angels, and it's very different from the story of the fall of human beings. We are already comfortable with the fact that there can be more than one intelligence, the fact that these intelligences will have their own relationship to God, and that we shouldn't judge ahead of time how it plays out. I mentioned how religion is, UFOs is somehow a religion substitute. I think part of the fascination is recognizing this fallen world, recognizing all the hurt and the crime and the sin, and hoping that a civilization that is advanced enough to build flying saucers will also be advanced enough to know how to solve all of these problems. They'll come to Earth and they'll be our saviors. Anybody seen this movie? It's about, a guy who does exactly that, doesn't have a happy ending. And in case you didn't get the parallels that the movie makers were making, in the movie, the savior from the UFO calls himself Mr. Carpenter. More to the point, though, this kind of thinking makes a fundamental philosophical mistake. And it's a mistake that you've encountered millions of times, hundreds of times, dozens of times, depending how often you come to these meetings. People trying to draw parallels between science and religion. Science is cumulative. The science that we're teaching at the university today is different from the science that I learned 40 years ago, because we've learned more since then. I mean, I've got two really big, thick books on my desk. One's the Bible, one's Mr. Thorne and Wheeler's Gravitation. Mr. Thorne and Wheeler has been out for, 30 years now? It's out of date. It's obsolete. Time to pitch it. Do we have any college students in this room? Okay, college students. Let's say that you're taking a biology class and you're taking a class in Shakespeare, and you're broke. So you go through your mom's library, because she went to college, and you find a book of Shakespeare's plays, so you don't have to buy one. It's even got all of her notes in the margin, so you can write papers based on what she was thinking. And you find your mom's biology book. It's not going to work, is it? You can get away with the Shakespeare book, but not the biology book. Science is cumulative in that what we know now is more than what we knew 10 years ago. By design. By the fact that we have said we're going to limit ourselves to the things that we can cumulate. Ethics is not cumulative. We are not more ethical now than we were 100 years ago. Let's look around. Why not? Because if we were, then it would be a kind of tyranny. The whole point of ethics is to make free choices, to make free decisions based on your understanding of right and wrong given the situation that you are in. And only you can make that decision. Somebody who wrote a book 50 years ago can't tell you how to make that decision. They can give you outlines, they can give you models, they can tell you this is, worked out examples from the past. That's how you will learn what good decisions look like. But at the end of the day, every human being has to live his life or her life for themselves. It can't be accumulative. Just because a race has built spaceships that can cross space does not at all imply that they're going to be more ethical than us. Just the fact that we can build spaceships doesn't mean that we're more ethical than the people in Roman times or Greek times. That's not how ethics works. So let's stay with science fiction. This is one of my favorite science fiction magazines in the 50s. Somebody asked me what was the golden age of science fiction. The answer, of course, was 14. But this is from the other so-called golden age of the 1950s. And the reason I have it up there is because of its title, If. If there are planets suitable for life around other stars, if there actually is life on those planets, if that life is intelligent, if that life is in a free, self-aware, loving relationship with the Creator, if that life can successfully communicate what they've learned from that relationship to us, then we're going to have a lot to talk about. But if there's any one in that chain of ifs that's not true, it's hopeless. And right now, we don't know. Right now, we are left not with science or theology, but with speculation, science fiction. And that's all right, as long as you recognize that what we're talking about from here on out is speculation. It's not theology, it is science fiction. The other thing about science fiction is never about the past, it's never about the future, it's always about the year in which it was written. Because it's really using a view of others to try to reflect back on ourselves. So asking the question, do you baptize an extraterrestrial, is fabulous in that it makes you try to wonder, what does baptism mean? What does it mean to be an alien? What does it mean to have an intelligence? These are the questions that we can chew on without ever thinking we're going to come to a final answer. Appreciating God as a creator of the universe big enough to contain all the galaxies and all the stars makes us realize how infinite God really is. So, this is basically, I've just several of these things. So let's look a little bit at what the science of finding life elsewhere would be like and what it would teach us. Because there's more than just indulging in our fantasies. In order to understand questions like, what does it mean to be human? Human as compared to what? What is it like to be intelligent? Intelligent as compared to what? What is it like to be in a loving relationship compared to? Let's imagine you grew up on a desert island with palm trees and nothing else. Would you know that this thing is a tree? You might be able to. But it's only until you see this that you begin to recognize what are the things that trees have in common, And what are the things that just happen to be particular to this tree, or just happen to be particular to that tree? It's only by having more than one example that you can begin to generalize and see what's unique and what's general. That's why the thought experiments that come out in science fiction are so valuable. Because you can posit a computer with intelligence. A computer is so intelligent to be self-aware. But is it free? If it only does what its programming does. There are people out there who are going to tell you that intelligence is nothing more than lots of complexity. Which I don't believe. It's a little different talk. So let's guess, assume for the moment that it's true. Is it possible to be intelligent without being free? A science fiction story can create such a creature, place it into human context, and then tell a story about it. Because it is in story that those of us who are living stories in our lives can compare that story with our experience of how people work, and we can say, no, I'm sorry, people don't work that way, or, yeah, you're right, that's what would happen. That's the power of story. You could have creatures other than human creatures who are maybe even immortal, but still not gods, like the immortal elves of Tolkien. You could have a world set in a long tube in space, spinning with a bar of light down the center that looks like the sun, and people living in this colony for so long that they've forgotten that they're living in a spaceship. Some of the work that the Litany of the Long Sun, G. Wolfe. I mentioned these three authors because all of them happen to be Catholics. You find, and I've been in the science fiction world now for as long as I've been in the, longer than I've been in the science world. I went to MIT because they've got the world's biggest collection of science fiction. And what I have found is that while the number of believers in British journalists is vanishingly small, the number of religious believers among science fiction fans and science fiction writers is remarkably large. And even those who would self-identify as atheists are still asking the same big questions. And still in a wonderful relationship and great respect for those fellow writers who are not atheists. One of the insights that all of these writers have is, you know, as scientists, if I'm looking at a distant star, my first assumption is the laws of physics there are going to be the same as the laws of physics here. And everything that I've observed of stars has, you know, nothing has violated that assumption so far. Nothing has made me challenge the thought that the laws of physics are somehow different. The question that they ask, are the laws of good and evil the same? Is what is evil still evil? Is what is good still good? Does that change if you're immortal? Does doing right or wrong change if you're a computer? Can you do right or wrong if you're not free? I'm reminded of a wonderful cartoon of a cat appearing on a table, and there's a little can of tuna on the table, and a little devil angel on one side, a little devil on one side of the cat going, go ahead, jump up on the table, eat that tuna. And a little angel cat on the other side is going, sounds good to me. What does it take to have the freedom to make these choices? And how essential is that? These are the thought experiments that can come out in a science fiction story. Because not only are all the characters of a science fiction story actually written in the year, you know, representing the year that they're written, they're also really representing. If you're going to have a story, you've got to have a character who is aware and who is free to make choices. Because if you don't have choices, you don't have a story. Now, there are practical sides if you're thinking about the physics. Would you pour water on a creature that finds water poisonous? Somebody said, what if the creature is made out of sodium and you pour water on them? To which my answer is, they get double. They get baptism by water and baptism by fire. You know, can't find the forehead. All of that reminds you that there's more to baptism than the incidentals. That that's not what is essential to baptism. Father Ernie McMullen, who was a philosopher at Notre Dame University, suggested that discovering extraterrestrial life would inspire theologians to develop new ways to think about topics like original sin, the immortality of the soul, the meaning of Christ's redemptive act. But then, he points out, there's already a huge literature on all of those topics, and nobody agrees on any of them already. So it's not clear how that would change anything. Father Giuseppe Tanzella Nitti, who is an astronomer teaching at the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross in Rome, is an Opus Dei priest. So politically in the Catholic Church, we've got the two sides represented. Comes to exactly the same conclusion. He wrote about extraterrestrial life in the Dizionario Interdisciplinare di Scienze e Fede. At the end, he concludes, and I quote from my translation, "The last word on the question of extraterrestrial life will not come from theology but science. The existence of intelligent life on planets other than Earth neither rules in nor rules out any theological principle. Theologians, like the rest of the human race, are just going to have to wait and see." So, what's likely to happen if we do wait and see? The first point, which I cannot emphasize enough, is we don't know. Of all the planets in our solar system, it's not clear if any of them other than Earth can support life, though they might, much less intelligent life. No place in our sun's system have we yet found evidence that convincingly and uncontrovertibly proves that life originated someplace other than Earth. That's why people want to go to Mars, but are also very afraid of going to Mars. I don't want to send an astronaut to Mars. Why? Because astronauts leak E. coli. And what I'm afraid of is that 10 years after the astronaut is there, we'll dig up some piece of Martian dirt and find that it has life, but the life is the same as life on Earth. And then we'll never know. Did it come from Earth, or did it go? You've heard the argument, in fact, all life originated on Mars and was carried by a meteorite from Mars to Earth. And the best argument for that is the day on Mars is 24 hours and 37 minutes long. And didn't you really expect another 37 minutes this morning when you were lying in bed? In the past 10 years, we've been able to discover evidence of planets orbiting other stars. For the most part, it's indirect. You see the star wiggling back and forth. You see the light dipping up and down. But we now have thousands of potential planets. We know that planets are common. We also know that none of the solar systems we've found so far look anything like Earth's solar system. But that's not totally surprising, because if we were on another of those planets looking back at us with the technology we have now, we would not have found our solar system yet. Just as an example, the biggest planet in our solar system, Jupiter, is the one most likely to pull the sun back and forth. You've got to see the sun going back and forth 3 times before you're convinced that it's not just a blip, that it's got a period. Well, that means 3 periods of Jupiter. 3 times 12 is, we'd have to be observing for 36 years. We haven't been observing for 36 years. We would not have seen Jupiter yet. We also have to recognize that there are lots of different types of planets. Warm Earths, small Earths, hot Jupiters, ice planets. We have to be willing to accept that planets might have life in places we couldn't see it. One place that's been suggested a lot is the moon of Jupiter called Europa. Europa is mostly rock, but it's about 10 to 15% ice. The ice makes a thick crust. The heat from the flexing of the ice crust is enough to make the water in the ice melt, so that there's a thick ice crust, and then a molten ocean, and then a hot rocky core that may have volcanoes and things going on. It's conceivable there could be life in that ocean. I'm not the first person to suggest it. In my 1975 thesis, I specifically state, which was about the icy moons of Jupiter and how they melt, I specifically stated, I am not going to predict life in these oceans. I'll leave that for someone else to do. So I'm the first person to not predict life. But if there was life in those oceans, not only would we not be able to see it, because it's covered by a crust of several to tens of kilometers thick, but the life in that ocean might never know that there's a universe on the other side of the crust. How would they know? Which makes you wonder, what barriers are there to us here on Earth that cut us off from seeing enormously important parts of the universe that we can't otherwise see? There are some people who argue that life is inevitable. There are some people that argue that life is rare. The fact of the matter is, we don't know. If we could find just one other example of life, we'd at least have 2 points and we could fit a straight line to it and extrapolate wrongly. But with 1 point, we don't even know which way to extrapolate wrongly. Anything's possible. But even if life turns out to be rare, how rare would it have to be not to exist anywhere? We've already found planets around all the stars near us, or not all of them, but so many of the stars near us. And we've only looked at stars within 50 light years of Earth. But our galaxy is 100,000 light years across. There are 100 billion stars in it. And our galaxy is one of a couple hundred billion galaxies. So you add that all together, and that's a number with a whole lot of zeros after it. It would have to be incredibly rare if we were the only place that didn't have life. But that doesn't help us in terms of asking, are we going to be baptizing extraterrestrials? The farther away you look, the greater the odds are you're going to find a place that has life. But the farther away you look, the harder it is to actually communicate with that life, to get a good conversation going. It's the speed of light issue. If I'm talking to Alpha Centauri, it's going to take 4 years for my message to get there and 4 years for the message to get back. And if that's not true, if there's some science fictional way of being able to warp ourselves and go and communicate information faster than light, you can very quickly show that that violates causality, that you can find someplace in the universe where the cause appears after the effect, which violates everything we think is logical about how the universe works. Well, I could hear Thomas Aquinas saying similar arguments based on the physics he knew in 1200. So come back in another 1,000 years, and maybe we'll have figured out a way out of that. But at the moment, that's the best physics we've done. And that means that there's a very limited number of species that we could communicate with. The best example of what it would be like to communicate with somebody that was 2,000 light years away would be the way that there is a civilization that we know of that is 2,000 years removed from us, namely the civilization of 2,000 years ago. It's a one-way conversation. They can talk to us. We can't go back and ask them. And Plato, what did you really mean? That's the kind of conversation we would be having. It would still be fascinating to hear because we've learned an awful lot from a communication of 2,000 years ago. But it would be a one-way conversation. Still, the very possibility of intelligent life puts a human face, a human-like face, on the sense of how big the universe is. It gives you these sobering thoughts about what is the meaning of God's salvation. It also gives us a new way of picturing what it really means to be baptized. The issue came up 2,000 years ago with St. Paul and St. Peter and all the other guys getting together, trying to decide whether or not they should let Gentiles into the church. Pope Francis was trying to describe, to give you a gut feeling of what it must have been like, the proposition that we should let Gentiles into the Christian church. He said, imagine today if some Martian with a funny hair and a big nose came in and wanted to be baptized. How would you react? Naturally, as soon as he said that, the press went wild and said, the Pope has just endorsed him, baptizing extraterrestrials. And then, I don't know if you're familiar with this, Eye of the Tiber. This is the Onion for Catholics. And so they ran this story. No, Minotaurs and Krakens, I wouldn't baptize them. My co-author on this book pointed out that there's actually two aspects to that question when you baptize E.T. Is E.T. worthy of being baptized? But there's also the question, who are you to decide? Would you baptize E.T.? Or are you going to wait for her to make a decision? The actual question raises a point. Is baptism a rite of passage so that you get to join the club? Or is it more than that? If this is representative of baptism, those dogs ought to be out there helping Rusty get across the street, rather than daring him to put life at risk. People keep asking, would you baptize an extraterrestrial? We keep answering. They keep asking anyway. Which tells me that the question they're asking is not the question we're answering. Why don't we put it in a different way? Would you share a meal with E.T., as in the famous movie? Would E.T. share a meal with you? If you saw E.T. injured by the side of the road, would you go out of your way to help her? Would she do the same for you? Would you be willing to give up your life to save E.T.? Would E.T. be willing to give up her life to save you? If you can answer yes to those questions, you're already living together in the kingdom of God. Usually, the Christian idea that we are the center of God's attention, getting the special spark here, implies that there's something about human beings that's different and special from the rest of the universe. And that would then make it uncomfortable to say, well, human beings, but also these people with funny tentacles. But wait a minute. The relationship we see there is a relationship of love. And if you've ever experienced love, you know that love does not exclude. When you're in love with somebody, hope him if you're holding his hand, presumably that experience that didn't used to be there and is there now has made you also love everybody else in a new way, in a different way. And everybody loves a lover. What if it's not that there is something different about human beings that makes them lovable? It's that there's something typical about human beings that is typical of and essential to the universe itself. It's been said that in the human race, the universe has become self-aware. But of course, there's no such thing as the human race. It's just you and you and you. And in you, the universe has become self-aware. And also in you. And I'm not sure about you, but in you. There have been billions of people in the past of human history, and I hope billions of people in the future, who will be the self-awareness of the universe. And who's to say that that's any different if there are other races that are also self-aware? So that baptism is not something that separates us. The spark of God is not something that separates us. But the spark of God is what all of this is actually all about. Carl Sagan used to say that we are made of star stuff. The atoms that we're made of are the atoms that used to be in stars. All true. But maybe, in an essential way, stars are made out of us stuff. The reason for stars to exist is so that there can be love in the universe, self-awareness in the universe, intelligence in the universe. The existence of all these other self-aware entities raises an interesting challenge to each of us. Are we willing to accept that there are other entities out there? Are we willing to accept the presence of other self-aware entities in the universe that are also sharing this relationship we have with God? You know, it's a huge leap from having this nice, comfortable, one-on-one relationship, me and God. You hear this, all the people who say, well, I don't go to church, but I'm very spiritual. You're very selfish, is what you're saying. That you just want me and God, I don't want anybody else involved. It kind of makes you wonder, after a while, the people who say, I'm very spiritual, but I don't belong to a religion, besides being utterly egotistical, because they think that it's just them and God, are they sure they're really talking to God? Maybe they're just talking to themselves. What we learn from the Gospels is that an essential part of our relationship with God is finding God in other people. That the community, especially a community made up of 12 obnoxious fishermen, one of whom's going to turn traitor, others who are going to doubt everything you say, others who are going to come up with crazy ideas like we should let the Gentiles in. That in some way, it's in this community that we find God. And that means not just our neighbors. It may also mean E.T. In some ways, E.T. may be easy to deal with in our neighbors. But if E.T. is self-aware, able to love, able to make the choice to love or not love, well, those are the attributes of the soul that you find in medieval theology. That is the image and likeness of God. It also means that all those bad science fiction stories out there where it's usually a Jesuit discovers the race of people who have never sinned, and that's this. If you've never sinned, you've never demonstrated that you're free to sin or not sin. How would you know that a race isn't one of these pre-programmed, self-aware computers that is incapable of making a free choice, if you've never seen them make a free choice? It goes back to the thought that the advanced civilizations can't be more advanced in ethics than us. You can't develop a calculus of ethics where you turn the crank and the right answer always comes out of the computer. And we should expect that of any race, whether they're the most advanced or we're the most advanced, because either way it's a sobering thought. There's one other thing I'll just leave you with. Intelligence itself only makes sense if there's another intelligence to communicate with. What's the point of being intelligent if you're all alone? That's why we have a room full of people here, and in a minute or two you're all going to jump up and challenge half of the things I've said, rightly so, because I'll guarantee you half of what I've said is wrong. I just don't know which half. But that's how we both learn and grow. But that also means that the second person of the Trinity, who was around long before planet Earth, was there at the beginning, who died for sins, that the need for redemption will always be there. And that dying for sins, even as it was a specific act in a specific place in a specific time, was also universal. For all time, for all creatures. I mentioned science fiction. I'm going to end with one of my favorite bits of science fiction. It's a poem written by an English woman in 1917, which was 10 years before the first bad science fiction magazines came out. With this ambiguous earth, his dealings have been told us. These abide: the signal to a maid, the human birth, the lesson, the young man crucified. But not a star of all the innumerable hosts of stars has heard how he administered this terrestrial ball. our race have kept their Lord's entrusted word. Of his earth-visiting feet, none knows the secret, cherished, perilous, the terrible, shamefast, frightened, whispered, sweet, heart-shattering secret of his way with us. Nor in our day may his devices with the heavens be guessed, his pilgrimage to thread the Milky Way, or his bestowals there be manifest. But in the eternities, doubtless we shall compare together, hear a million alien gospels, in what guise he trod the Pleiades, the lard, the bear. Oh, be prepared, my soul, to read the inconceivable, to scan the million forms of God, those stars unroll, when in our turn we show to them. Amen. Thank you very much.
So we'll have our usual custom here, about 10 minutes of questions for Brother Guy, and then we can break and have refreshments and so on, and then people who would like to stick around can, and we can sit around and have a discussion a little bit more informally. So with that, questions?
Yeah. So, as Christians, is it safe to say, if someone asks us, do you believe in extraterrestrials, we can say yes due to God and the angels, or were they...
There's nothing in our faith that rules them out, but we don't have the evidence of their existence.
Okay. I was just saying,
but
to accept angels, would that not be to accept...
Well, the argument usually given by people who say that you can't be a Christian is that God created humans, and human beings are the center of a relationship with God. And that's not Christianity, because God also creates angels. God also, there are other creatures in the Old Testament, the Nephilim, and all sorts of other weird things you find in the early parts of Genesis. None of which I don't think are supposed to have any deep philosophical, certainly none of them are scientifically significant. All of them merely saying that we don't have to be the only ones out there. And you could argue whether angels are creatures of the same sort as human beings. But you can equally argue, who cares? That's not what's essential.
If we find life on one of Jupiter's moons, it's like microscopic.
Yeah.
We baptize it anyway.
It's already covered in water. Quite seriously, the joke answer that I gave is actually the serious answer. You only offer baptism when it's absent. And that asking presupposes such an enormous amount of ifs that, in a practical sense, I don't see it happening in my lifetime. There are two other embarrassing questions that can come up, which are wonderful what-if questions. If you met an extraterrestrial who was in a relationship with God, would you ask that extraterrestrial to baptize you, or whatever their right is? And would that be a rejection of our culture if you did that? I don't know. I could write the science fiction story that goes either way. It's a wonderful thought experiment. The other question, of course, is, would you ordain an extraterrestrial? I'm not going to go there.
I have a question. I asked this question actually with your colleague. We believe in the Trinity, and I'm not trying to be human-centric here, but and we believe that Christ is given a body, a human body, and then he has that body
for eternity.
For eternity. Yeah. It's a human body, though, so he couldn't then come and have saved other creatures in other bodies because he is in heaven for eternity in a human body.
He's also present in the Eucharist. How does that contradict the fact that he has a human body?
Well, I guess I was saying he couldn't have come and redeemed other creatures.
How is that?
As a human.
No, you could not.
Or as a creature with tentacles, too, or whatever.
Right. Well, I'll give you the answer that I suspect Chris Corbally gave, because I'm stealing it from him.
Yeah.
In the beginning was the Word. The Word can be expressed in different languages, but it's the same word. Maybe. That's one possibility. I don't want to rule it out. On the other hand, it could very well be that this sacrifice was unique. I don't know.
Spinning off of that, Jesus, or God came down to us, as flesh and man to save, us. Is it possible there was intelligent life that didn't need to be saved but didn't fall from grace?
Well, that's the issue. If they don't fall from grace, how do you know they could fall from grace? And if they're not free, then they're not in the image and likeness of God, because freedom is an essential part. Free will is an essential part of the soul. Does that mean that sin is necessary? There's this part of the Easter liturgy that goes, "Oh, happy fault." Because, and I've never understood that, and I've never been comfortable with that, but I think I know what they're talking about. It also means, I know as a scientist, I make mistakes all the time. Any scientist who's never made a mistake does not know science, because the essence is recognizing your mistake, but you have to make it before you can recognize it. And sin will happen to each of us. It's our duty to recognize it and then do something about it.
So let's assume that the church takes seriously that there are extraterrestrials that might want to ask, or that would ask us if we wanted to be baptized, and they consider that perspective. How do you think it would change Christianity or the formal religions of Christianity? Because I think right now we're pretty earth-centered.
Yeah, we are. And we're very culture-centered. And we're very gender-centered. And we're very me-centered. I'm telling you, I'm interested in that for me. Obviously, they wouldn't. I hope they wouldn't do that, because it would be ridiculous to make a decision in the absence of the data. And right now, the data is absent. I think a different way of answering it, which is to say the answer that I've got prepared rather than the answer to your question, because it's a good one. There have been surveys that Ted Peters at the Center of Theology and the Natural Sciences in Berkeley did a survey. If we discovered extraterrestrials, would that challenge your faith? And 90% of everybody said no, it wouldn't. And in fact, we saw in the history that the atheists are convinced that finding extraterrestrials will show that religion was ridiculous, and the believers are convinced that finding extraterrestrials will show that God really is a marvelous creator. You wind up recovering the assumption you made. Everybody thinks that finding extraterrestrials will confirm the things they've already decided ahead of time they're going to believe. The fact that we haven't found extraterrestrials hasn't challenged anybody's belief. Which is to say, it's not a critical experiment. It's not an experiment that will make a difference. And that's kind of interesting.
More questions?
And I actually heard, I think it was Michael Crow, I'm not sure, somebody argued that, if we found extraterrestrials, if we found extraterrestrial life, everybody on Earth would go, wow, about time. Because we've all grown up so used to the idea that they're there, that I think we've already built that into our understanding of how the universe works. So I don't think it would be one of these shattering experiences for the human race. It would be far more shattering if there was some way of proving that there were no other life than us. I think it would be the real simple.
Well, God, there's an example of that. According to the average people out there, there's life on Mars. They found microbes. It's never been retracted.
Right.
That's not right, but it's never been retracted.
Well,
but it was front page news in the Times that there's life on Mars. I thought that would have been a sociological phenomenon, like the landing of man on the moon. And everybody said, well, it doesn't have big tentacles and ray guns, so who cares?
That's even, you're talking about the life found in this little meteorite.
Yeah.
And, I've got stories about meteorites in my field. Let me get a story about it.
Go for it.
Go for it.
So, the year that was discovered, 1996, I was flying from Rome, or my meteorite lab is visiting some friends at Stony Brook, SUNY Stony Brook. And I'm in their home, and the phone rings, and Leonie answers the phone and looks at me with a funny look and says, "Guy, it's for you. It's a reporter in Woodward." Yeah, it was Ken Woodward, who was the religion editor for Newsweek. And he asks, I'm on vacation. I heard about this life on Mars. What is the theological significance? I go, none that I can see. If it's life, it's life. If it's not, it's not. And he goes, well, that's kind of what I thought too. But I've got 2 columns that I have to fill by the end of the day. So I gave him the name of a few other people, Protestant, a Catholic, a Jew, that he could all talk to. He calls me up about 4 hours later from his vacation home, and he says, okay, here's what I have you saying, based on our earlier conversation. Finding life on another planet would be an indication of God's creative power. Yeah, that sounds great. Totally meaningless. Says nothing, but it sounds really good. Great, we'll go with that. So the next week, I pull up Newsweek. I open it up. The headline, "A Vindication of God." What? How could God be vindicated? So I'm reading along, according to Brother Guy Consolmagno, spelled wrong, finding life on another planet would be a vindication of God's creative. I had said indication. He had said indication on the phone back to the headquarters in New York, where the intern had written it down as vindication rather than indication, and then made it the headline. Well, here's the weird thing. As you say, the paper's never been retracted. The interesting thing about that Martian meteorite is that they found 4 different things which they interpret as life. No one disputes that they found those things. No one disputes the data. The dispute is entirely in the interpretation of the data. And it's a philosophical. Occam's razor says you choose the simpler answer. Is it simpler to say one explanation that could explain all of them, namely life on Mars, or 4 different explanations that by coincidence all happen in the same place in this rock, but they're all things that we actually know do happen on Mars? Which is simpler. So a friend of mine, meteoriticist at U of A, did a survey. Half the people, this is, soon afterwards, half the people said, this is ridiculous. There's not a 5% chance that there's any truth to this at all about life. And the other half said, this is fascinating, this is good stuff. There may be a 5% chance that it's true. They both came up with the same ridiculous 5% number out of nowhere, but then interpreted it in a completely different way. That's why science is not done with computers. Here's the last really interesting thing. Because of the discovery of that rock, NASA has invented millions of dollars in studying astrobiology, has created a field that's doing a lot of good science, learning a lot of things we didn't know about life on Earth and where it came from and how it could survive. We are looking at Mars as intently as we ever were. It doesn't matter whether it really was life or not. Again, how interesting. It was not a critical experiment. Also, that rock had all of the things that anyone a year earlier would have said would have been evidence until we actually saw the evidence and we said, no, not good enough. There's something, in your gut that says, yeah, I believe it, or no, I don't. And that's why computers don't do science, why human beings do science. And where the religion enters into the science that's what forms your gut instincts. That's what forms your expectations of how the universe ought to work. That's what gives you the confidence to believe that the universe works at all. And it's not all just chaos, or the actions of some deities that are causing it to happen. But that's a whole different topic.
Okay, let's thank Brother Guy.